Welcome to Prime Suspects. Alongside Prime Sports co-founder Joe Brennan Jr., I'm your host, Matt Landis. And in a Prime Suspects first, no Adam Bjorn this week. In his place, we've got Alex Kane, the CEO and founder of Sporttrade, the only regulated sports betting exchange in the US. Alex, typically we kick off this show with a segment peeling back the curtain on the inner workings at Prime. But with your presence this week, would love to start by having you tell us about yourself and Sporttrade.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, guys. Joe gave me a bit of a hard time for saying this, but I have listened to every single episode. So undefeated so far. I've loved the content. Congratulations. How many episodes? You guys are 85-ish at this point?
Just about.
That's at least 40 hours of your life that would have been better spent elsewhere, my friend.
I love this industry. I really love, obviously, what Prime stood for at Chris and you guys more generally. So
did they shut down? Wait a second. Stands, right? They're still running as far as I logged in this morning.
Well, Joe, I've always thought of you as like the mayor of Prime, and now we're on the board and they're taking a seat back. So you're right. Stands for 100%. So I appreciate the opportunities for coming on. How are things inside Sporttrade? Obviously, Stanley Cup just wrapped up. We have this cool thing on Twitter called like the Sporttrade Whale Tracker. So big bets came in, I think, on Edmonton last night. So not too great for the consumer. US Open, we had a customer bet $20,000 to win 100 that Robert McIntyre would not win on Sunday morning. That was probably a little bit of a sweat for him, given that Robert McIntyre, I think, had like a 60% chance of winning once he got into the clubhouse at +1 about an hour before the leaders. So it's been good. You know, we're focusing on product. We're obviously focusing on this new regulatory environment, and our hands are full, but it's a blessing to do what we do. And I love what I do.
And on the heels of the US Open and Stanley Cup final recently concluding, we've also got the NBA finals approaching the home stretch. How's that been looking for you and your team?
Good. I think we get a lot of action in game, which is nice, particularly on the money line, which has always been my favorite sort of. It's a great bet for more of a beginner player to get involved just because you're watching the game and you're thinking of who's going to win. You don't have to think about the total or the spread. And I guess I'm more of a newbie bettor, but I've never really liked spreads just because the team's never really playing to cover. The team's trying to play to win. So I really like to try to, as a novice bettor myself, like align myself to that. I want to be on the side that the team is trying to achieve. So we get to see some really cool money line action where customers will buy something at 10% chance to win. The team flips to 20% and they sell their position, which is kind of cool. And it's kind of in our name, right? Sporttrade. And that's what we're trying to invent.
And I wasn't sure if we'd go down this path, but as you mentioned, being a newer bettor and also thinking of Adam with that brand of the betting bookmaker, how would you say that you've used your experience on the other side of the counter to inform your journey thus far as a bettor?
It's an interesting question. I think the way I came into sports betting is I was a finance and business law major at Drexel. I really didn't understand betting. And someone put Robinhood in my hand and I loved it right away. And I thought, this is so cool. Like you have a portfolio value. Like you put in $500, you put it all on IBM. IBM has good earnings. IBM goes up 10%. And now your portfolio value is $550. And you have this real-time dynamic number that tells you the value of you. And while betting is certainly not trading, it's certainly not investing, I always thought like, it could advantage itself. It could benefit from some of these features that are in these like retail trading apps. And so that's really what informed and continues to inform like the product at Sporttrade is like, if you take, the Pacers down 10 in the third quarter at 10% odds, you put in 100 and then they go to 20%. Well, now that bet is worth $200 and we ought to show you that. And we ought to tell you that in a real time way so that you as a consumer can make that choice of like, should I take $100 off the table, let the other 100 ride? And so that's always informed my, the product experience is more coming from a different perspective of like, hey, wait, if I place a bet, it technically should have a value until it settles. And if it does, show me that value and make me want to continue to engage with it. And that's a very different way, I think, of thinking about betting, which is more like, hey, give me the best price and let me sweat it out. Sporttrade's more about like, which way is the market going to go in the next 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes? And position yourself that way. And if you do well, we'll show you that the new value of your position.
And continuing down that path, if we want to zoom out a bit from what's happening in the sports betting marketplace right this moment, thinking about Sporttrade being founded in 2017, the year before PASPA was repealed and one of Joe's crowning achievements. In today's environment, where the news cycle can be dizzying minute to minute, let's take a step back and reflect on Sporttrade's ride so far in the regulated US market. Alex, what would you say you thought the PASPA repeal could mean for Sporttrade at the time? And in the 7+ years since then, how would you say that vision has gone according to plan? And to what extent has that plan just gone out the window?
I think you have to keep in mind in 2017, I had no idea what I was doing. And I still have no idea what I'm doing. And so I don't know. I started it sort of kind of as a side project graduating college. And I really thought I wanted to build this like exchange for sports and this, again, that more the user experience, like building something totally new, not trying to come up with a slightly better version of sports betting, but something where like customers could actually open up Sporttrade and say, I don't know who's going to win this hockey game, but I think Edmonton's going to score next. So I'll buy Edmonton. And if they score, I'll sell them. Like that is just like a totally different way of thinking about sports betting, particularly for more recreational players. And then, we figured out like we have to get market access and it's very hard to build the technology. We almost spent more time on the compliance stuff and the reporting and the financial audits and all of that, and less time on the fun stuff like the consumer experience and the exchange and the matching engine and the stuff that why we got into things. So we found that was an extraordinary challenge. It was extraordinarily expensive. We've probably spent $40 or $50 million to date trying to build everything the right way and get the licenses. And then obviously now that might all be flipped on its head by virtue of let's call it maybe a euphemism would say of decades old legislation and regulation. And so now we're trying to figure out how do we, fit in with that. But ultimately the focus is the same. The focus is try to build a consumer experience that's so different, right? That teaches players and encourages players to think about betting in the way that you might more think about trading, in that your bet should always have a real-time value.
Just real quick on what he was saying there. It's funny saying like, oh, we seem like we spend so much more time on compliance and reporting and market access. And, instead of like the really fun stuff, it's like, welcome to the club, brother. That we're all like that, It's like I constantly joke when people say like, oh, wow, you're in sports betting. That must be really awesome. I'm like, I'm still waiting to get to the sexy stuff where I'm just like hanging out with a cigar, counting my money and things like that. And they're like, nope, every day is another day in technicality land, whether it's a glitch on the site, whether it's, oh, we had this issue, that issue. Do we need to self-report? Oh, we're having this problem with reporting this automated report that goes to the states and anything. For anybody who's listening who thinks like, I'm going to get into the sports betting industry because it seems like it's really fun. We're not the guys with the reverse baseball caps that you see on TikTok. It's a professional's game every bit as much as if you were working at like an investment bank or something like that. So there's a lot of unsexiness, but absolutely it is critical that you get that stuff done, which is, that's why Alex, obviously you guys have done well. You've hung in there. I mean, you guys are not exactly a round peg in a square peg world, but with your model being so differentiated from the other sports books, you guys probably have it even more so being an exchange in a world where the legislation was written for guys like us in the sport book world. So good job on that. Just want to say I do have a Sporttrade account here. Thankfully, they're in Virginia, so I can actually trade on that. And I promise, Alex, I will get around to trading on that. When I actually get some free time and probably money.
Love it.
And speaking of those less sexy but critical components to all of this, Alex, you've written 2 open letters this year, one in March to U.S. regulators and legislators, calling for changes to the regulatory framework to foster innovation and entrepreneurship. And then in April, you also wrote to the CFTC seeking permission to offer Sporttrade nationwide to avoid irreparable harm. How would you describe your approach in terms of working with state regulators while simultaneously seeking to take Sporttrade nationwide, well beyond those 5 states in which you're currently operating?
Yeah, it's certainly going to be a challenge, and I don't want to portend or insinuate that I, once again, know exactly what I'm doing. However, I think we're going to enter a world where there might be 2 sets of regulators for this, and the delineation is looking more and more like, are these contract within public interest? Is there a real economic consequence? Can you make even a reasonable argument as to what you're listing having an economic consequence? And whereas I think the CFTC and Kalshi and some others have sort of landed on, the money lines and futures, it's harder and harder to see a world where, maybe player props or total points are going to be listable contracts. And so, in the 45 states where we don't have an online sports betting license, having a national strategy with a very bare minimum product is something that can kind of get us in the door. Whereas we want to actually keep those relationships with state regulators. We've invested, as Joe has done this times 10. So he would answer this question better than I, but you invest so much time and, relationship and trust in these people who are giving you a license. And we would never want to throw that away. So we've been very active in speaking with our regulators about this topic and just sharing notes. What are we hearing? What are you hearing? What is Sporttrade's plans from a federal perspective? And ultimately, we'd like to do both. And if we were to have the privilege of being able to operate nationally, I think we'd probably avoid listing our products or, trampling on the New Jersey license and the Arizona license and so on and so forth. So that's sort of our strategy for now. And for state regulators, like I know I'll see Joe at the Nickel G's conference here in Louisville in a couple of weeks, but just implore them to think more on a risk-based approach as opposed to a rule-based approach. If you have a licensee coming to you and saying, I'm going to pay you all this money and I'm going to invest a ton of time and resources in trying to legitimize you as a regulator, and I'm going to pay a crap ton of taxes. You as a regulator should try to find every single way to say yes, even if it's a model you haven't thought about, even if it's a sort of thing that hasn't existed before. I think Sporttrade and a lot of these companies in a lot of ways are good people and they want to try to do things the right way. And so that was the point of that first open letter, is like find ways to say yes, predicated on the counterparty being a good person, wanting to pay tax, wanting to do things the right way. Because as Joe will tell you, doing this the right way is like really, really hard.
And Joe, I heard Alex reference your experience a few times there. So how would you describe your thoughts on this whole dynamic?
I think regulators are in a really tough position. I mean, first of all, they can only work with what their lawmakers give to them, right? And gaming is a fairly conservative world, at least on the lawmaking, regulating side. So they're not really, it's not that they can't be entrepreneurial in a sense, which sounds like what Alex is asking them to be, because they're also incredibly under-resourced. Regulators, since we've brought these changes to them, to their doorstep, whether it was like 2013 when we got online gaming, online casino legalized in New Jersey, and then with 2018 with the overturning of PASPA and everything that's come since. That market has grown. It's grown exponentially. One thing that hasn't grown is resources available to regulators to regulate the gaming industry. They are still doing this more or less with the same number of personnel and the same budgets and the same resources that they had when they were just regulating the brick and mortar casino industries in their state. Asking them to be proactive is kind of tough. So you do have to adopt a mindset of, all right, and this is just my opinion. I mean, Alex might have a different experience. But when you go to regulators, you can't just come to them and say like, hey, this is a really cool idea that we want to explore. There has to be a real tangible benefit for that state, for those regulators, for their citizens, in order to get them to move on something. I mean, a great example right now that, is maybe a little more practical is cryptocurrency. Okay. I have badgered our regulators, and badgering probably is I've definitely gone from a more diplomatic to like, come on, guys. I mean, most of the stuff that's going on and offshore right now, that's not flowing into your legal coffers here right now, is in the form of crypto. Let's meet these guys where they're already at. And basically, summing up what regulators are saying is like, look, you're asking us to do something that we don't have any more resources. We don't have anything additional. And now you want to bring us one more potential problem. And also, by the way, when I was really hounding them about this was when, Sam Bankman-Fried and the rest of those morons were really giving crypto a great name, So the news cycle has changed on crypto a little bit, but it's a problem. So whenever you come up with something, and you say, like, we want to do things, or we want to do things differently, or this is a new thing that we want to do. As much as it feels really great to sit here and know, like yourself, when you're creating something like this is going to do this for players, or this technology is going to advance, or this so much better experience, or anything like that. In order to get regulators to buy in, you always have to lead with, this is what the benefit to the state is. Okay. And it doesn't have to be, super complex. If it's more tax revenue, more liquidity coming into the regulated market, meaning less is flowing into the unregulated markets, things like that, That's a good answer for them. It's a very good answer for them.
And keeping with the tension here, let's go ahead and pivot to the regulated state model's sustainability. Thinking about Illinois as an example in recent weeks, and now Wyoming this week as the latest state exploring a substantial tax increase. Joe, some people may see this as a tipping point toward federal regulation, with Sunday's story by Pat Evans on legalsportsreport.com exploring a proposal to use the federal U.S. sports betting excise tax to fund immigration and customs enforcement. Your response to this on Twitter: for everyone that would like to see sports betting regulated at the federal level, here's your preview of the challenges faced. The industry is fast becoming everyone's favorite piggy bank to raid. Would love it if you could elaborate on this through that lens of state versus federal regulation.
So, I mean, right now, the Gambler Act, which is the most tortured acronym when you see what the name of the bill is to get to Gambler Act, is really, it's doing something right now that's fairly modest. Right now, the federal excise tax goes into the general fund. It's not earmarked for anything. And what this bill would do is it would earmark the entirety of those funds to go to border enforcement. When you talk about the amount that's involved, $300 million, compared to what the budget is for border enforcement, and I say this is somebody whose ICE headquarters is less than 2 miles from here where we're broadcasting this. It's $300 million I don't think that's 2 weeks worth of operating expenses for ICE based on the current budget projections. Okay, probably less than that. The problem that you have now is as soon as Congress starts saying ooh, sports betting money, ooh, what can we do with this? They're not just going to say, ooh, what can we do with the $300 million? They're going to start looking at it the same way the states are all looking at it right now and say, well, what if we doubled it? What if we tripled it? What if we made it 1%? And now we're getting into this realm of the turnover taxes or the Illinois with their mandated fixed fees that they're going to be assessing per each bet. And the Wyoming one really was great. Wyoming, God love Wyoming. Great place to hunt, great place to ski. It's a beautiful state. If you ever get an opportunity, go there. University of Wyoming, they gave my favorite Bills fan his best quarterback for his team, Josh Allen. It is not exactly the biggest sports betting market. The yield on it was not even $70 million in revenue. And so there's been roughly $6.5 million paid in taxes, which it doesn't seem like a big number. But when, I forget who the spokesman was for the committee in the Wyoming legislature who mentioned this, said we've been very generous to the industry. They've done really well by us. Well, no. It's nice to be able to operate in that state. It's always great to have the privilege to be able to operate in a state. Wyoming's market is not a particularly attractive market by the numbers compared to the costs and the costs that they would like to increase it. But there's this, again, it's this reflected sense that, and I always say this as I think at its heart, people think that we're in a dirty business and it's okay to double our taxes, triple our taxes, and really put the strap to us on this thing. And we can say this is not a partisan issue because Wyoming, Republican state, Ohio, Republican state, Illinois, as democratic a state as you could possibly get, and New York, who's the leader of them all, democratically controlled state. So it's just politicians like the cash flow coming through this business. This industry has done a poor job of educating these guys on what the commercials are, what the economics of this industry are. And because most of the lobbying that happened post-PASPA was done by people they were selling this thing based on the amount of handle going through. They didn't understand how this all funneled down into revenue and a few other gotchas on it. This is where we're at right now. And it is a troubling trend. But I think, in an odd way, it provides a business like Sporttrade a real opportunity here right now. ProfitX, they made big news by going to New Jersey, unbelievably saying here's your license back. We're going to go sweeps. It'd really be something for a Sporttrade who has been committed to the state by state model to try and run their business. And I'm not putting words or ideas into Alex's head, although I'd be surprised he didn't have them already, but be in a position to essentially do the same thing with performance contracts, DCM, and just say hey, thanks a lot, states. we're out. We're just going to go do this business. Because when you look at the amount of turnover that Kalshi is getting right now, wow. And they were a taco stand of an operation prior to doing sports. No offense, but that's the equivalent of what they were. And now look at them today.
And Alex, using that as a transition, thinking about the recent tax increase in Illinois, the proposal in Wyoming, the Gambler Act, what's your perspective on the current state of affairs?
Yeah, I think it's easy. I mean, I'm in my own bubble, as Joe knows, and Joe's kindly popped that bubble a couple of times and brought me back to reality. I'm here up in Vermont, and I'm taking this meeting here in a room that I needed to prop my computer up on some books. And so I've got a book here. I don't know if you guys can still see the screen. Can you guys see this? The book's called The Bedford Boys, to bring it home for Joe. Some nice suggested reading. It's about 23 boys in a small town of Bedford, Virginia, that were in the 116th Regiment of the 29th Infantry. And if you know anything about the 29th Infantry, they drew the short end of the stick, and they were to land on the dog sectors of Omaha Beach, starting at 6:30 a.m. on June 6, 1944. And their commanding officers told them that they had a 20% chance of ever seeing the U.S. again. Okay, so anytime I think my life's hard, or that things suck, or taxes suck, I think I could have been in those what were called LCAs or Higgins boats, puking in my helmet at 6:30 in the morning with Germans shooting at me from God knows where. So, the perspective I think is really, really important. And I think we're so lucky to do what we do, and taxes are a part of life. And it sucks that some of these states are putting these taxes out there. And I think to Joe's point, it makes some of the models that we like, the lower margin models, not feasible. But I'm an optimist. And I think over time that hopefully there can be a world where we can tax different products at different rates. It might take a long time, but I think people will see taxing flat wagers at 50 cents is just not going to work. And I'd be surprised if that tax in Illinois specifically was not sort of altered in some way, not to reduce the total amount of tax taken, but to do it in a more equitable way. I think, I'm a bit of an optimist, and I always go back to like, you know what, we're in sports betting, life's good. We might not be smoking cigars, to Joe's point, but we'll still live in good lives. So that's my view on the whole tax thing. It sucks, but sometimes I have to just take myself out of my bubble for a little bit and realize how lucky we all are.
Well said. Let me go out there and piss off all those legislators that we're going to see at Nickel G's. You stay on the right side of them.
And with that, let's shift gears from hot topics of today to potential hot topics of the future, namely the sports betting user experience. Last week on LinkedIn, innovation strategist Mateo Stupicic, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Mateo, laid out the following in terms of sportsbooks lagging behind the way fans watch and interact with sports today. Sportsbooks still follow desktop era logic, with things like odds tables and bet slips dominating a transactional experience, while user behavior has shifted from desktop to mobile and from studying odds tables to tapping through stories in search of a more social and reward-driven experience. He concludes the sportsbook of the future isn't a betting site, but a sports entertainment platform where betting feels like playing through the game and not around it. And most importantly, this isn't happening in isolation, but in connection with other apps as an extension of platforms fans are already using in their everyday lives. Alex, I know Sporttrade is actively working on improvements to the user experience. So what would you say you think Mateo gets the most right here? And where would you say you might see things a bit differently?
I think I might take Joe's side on this, in that like sports betting will always be a transactional business. Like you as a sportsbook operator, whether you're an exchange or book, you make zero money if someone isn't clicking a button to risk money to win money. And so at the end of the day, it is a transactional business. I think the way we think about it is we really like to focus on the in-play aspect. And so what we're coming out as a new feature next week is our sort of dynamic charting feature, where you kind of see the flow of the game. And I really like that, because I was showing my sister Robinhood. She's a Robinhood user. I was showing her like the March Madness stuff. And all of a sudden I get a call at Master Sunday from my sister. And she goes, Bryson or Rory? And I'm like, I don't know why you asking. She's like, I'm on Robinhood and Rory just fell off a cliff. And what she's talking about is she opened up the chart and she could actually see the story of the tournament without having to watch it. She could see that Rory was doing great. And all of a sudden he fell off a cliff and his percentage went from 50 to 20 or 30, and Bryson went from 30 to 50. And I think those are the types of features that I think are so interesting because it can captivate a retail audience like my sister, who's never, ever going to download DraftKings or FanDuel, hasn't even placed a bet on Sporttrade, to give you an idea of how she thinks about sports betting. Yet there's something that draws her in and keeps her captivated. And of course, once she places that bet on Rory, because he's dropped down to 30 and maybe she thinks he has a chance to come back, she's going to sit there and stare at that chart. And the point of the staring at the chart is not just to not have her transact again. The point is if he shoots back up to 60 and she sees a cash out button, she's going to hit it. And that to me, I think is, I'm not going to say it's the future of sports betting because there's so many different products and ideas, but I think there's going to be a larger and larger sliver or cross section of Americans that look at that and go, that's an easier way to think about this. I can just feel the momentum by looking at this chart and bet based on that momentum. It's kind of simple. There's not much to it, but I think that's something we're focused on a lot. I think the TikTokification is jump in, jump out. Will there be a point in the next 2 minutes? Like you just burn out the customer and it just doesn't feel that innovative, but I could 100% be totally wrong about all that.
And Joe, building on Alex's response, what do you make of that LinkedIn post and the potential future of the sports betting user experience?
Well, first of all, congratulations to Marco for putting himself out there like that. I mean, it's not easy, especially when you know you're going to get people who they're just going to go through your deck piece by piece and be like, well, what about this? And what about that? So, congratulations for him to be willing to take the slings and arrows of putting a piece out there like that. Having said that, a lot of what he said really isn't new. Okay. I mean, like his first recommendation on product was like swipe left, swipe right navigation for placing bets and things like that. We've seen a lot of those come and go. Gosh, I think we did an iteration of that internally, product development, when we first started Fast Fantasy. There's many reasons why, at least from a regulatory sense, it's a difficult piece because, sometimes the clumsy checkoff pieces is a way of being able to firmly establish that the player intended to place a bet. Okay. It may be clunky, but it's certainly much better than having people say like, well, I never intended to place that bet. And it minimizes the number of complaints and that you may have on those kind of things. There's a lot of things that are in there that I totally agree. Like, look, as far as like the nature of the customer, especially younger customers now, the way they're consuming media, we've talked about this here, where, gosh, you don't even have to watch the game anymore. You can be on Twitter, and if something happens in a game, in a hockey game, in a basketball game, in a football game, that's either dramatic or, it's a scoring play or something like that, it's on social in 30 seconds. So if you don't want to sit there and watch the game and you only want the highlights, we can get the highlights now in near real time. 30-second latency, great. The other thing is, like, as far as deeper integration, you have companies like, great example is Genius Sports right now with their BetVision product, which they're trying to be a kind of console overlay over the game broadcast. The difficulty is the latency of the video. Okay. Almost always our customers, whether it's Sporttrade or Prime or BetCris or whomever, they're sitting in front of a better video feed. It's called television. Then we can give them through our mobile devices or desktops or tablets. As soon as we're putting that stuff through our apps, through our content, and then out to the customer, it's a slowed experience. It's a potentially bad experience because markets aren't open. Because God knows the trading team is watching it in near real time on a trading feed. If a customer goes in and they're watching the game on our app, first I'd ask them, why are you watching it on our app instead of watching it on television? But secondly, and then they go and they want to make this transaction, like, ooh, I'll do this. And they get that goddamn lock, padlock icon. That's an incredibly frustrating experience. And you're going to have people just be like, well, this is no fun. I'm going to go do something else. A lot of this stuff I would agree with. I've said for a long time, there's nothing inherently pleasurable about placing a bet, the act of placing a bet. Like slot machines, which I don't play, but you can understand it because there's all this bright content, branded content, and it's amazing. It's just the press of a button. That's all you got to do, and you get overwhelmed, this euphoric wash of content all over you. So there's something inherently pleasurable about that. There's something inherently pleasurable about like throwing down cards or throwing dice or watching the roulette ball go. When you look at a sports bet, like, okay, I'm looking at a fairly Excel spreadsheet financial transaction, and I just hit submit. And then, wow, there's nothing inherently exciting about that. So the more people try and push, try and find ways to make it more inherently pleasurable to do it, I'm all in favor of it. But again, a lot of this stuff has been discussed before. When all you have to do is look at FanDuel and DraftKings, especially DraftKings, who since their IPO and before their IPO, we're talking about being not a sports book, but a sports entertainment company, and how they were going to do these things. I think if you go back to their prospectus when they were going to go IPO, you'll see threads of this, what Marco mentioned in his PowerPoint deck, mentioned in their prospectus. So all that tells me is Marco's right. That type of innovation still hasn't happened, in part because it's not easy to make it happen with a lot of the inherent limitations that we have because of the feeds and the content and things like that. But he's right. We got to find different ways to push the experience because, people, they have shorter attention spans. They have less commitment. Although, and I'll end with this, you do have to eventually ask yourself, how much do I want to develop my product for the least engaged, highest churn customer versus my most engaged, most profitable customer? That's the tough choice that we all have to make. We all want those Gen Zers, and their milk money, because that's kind of the amount of money that they have. And we want to build our audiences. But for that 40-something guy who's betting 5,000, 10,000 with us, they're very meat and potatoes. Some of them, they'd be happy if we just gave them an API, right? So that's always a difficult trade-off as well.
Not to be the obnoxious fact checker, but Joe, I heard Marco a couple of times. I went back and triple checked. I am seeing Mateo as the originator of all of this as a Matt.
Don't I get like the old guys discount? All right, Mateo, everybody, if you get a chance, and let's put the link to his thing up in the show notes, right? Because give it a read. But Mateo, no offense, Mateo, Marco would have been a lot better for you. It's more commanding. But Mateo, it's excellent that he put himself out there. I read his deck 3 times over and then in bits and pieces. It's worth a read.
All right, well said. And as a Matt, I felt compelled to make that clarification in the spirit of attribution and on all of the possible notes on which we could have wrapped up this conversation.
You love fact checking me. Ever since I said that Oklahoma City was like the 67th media market and you fact checked me, oh no, it's the 47th. I think you're just dying for this. We should have a betting category. Like, what's Joe going to get fact checked on this week?
Yeah, chalk it up to the journalism degree at USC, where this platform is maybe the best application I have for it these days. So also had to take a jab since you've got the Notre Dame shirt going today.
There we go. All right. Well, maybe you guys will have a good year this year in the Big Ten.
With that, before we take this totally off the rails with Alex on board with us, we will go ahead and close up shop. To the audience, whatever the future holds for the sports betting user experience, as well as state and/or federal regulation, thanks as always for tuning in. And Alex, a special thank you to you for filling Adam's shoes this week and becoming our first guest. The over cashes easily on your line for a recording time of 28 minutes, 1.5 seconds. We appreciate the fresh perspective you've brought to this show. I know Joe's going to see you soon at Nickel G's, and we all look forward to reconnecting soon in person at Bet Dash.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Prime Suspects. Register for Prime Sports at primesports.com and download the Prime Sports app. You can follow us on Twitter at PrimeSuspects_, at Joe Brennan Jr., and at AdamBjorn2. You must be 21 or over to play on Prime Sports. Always bet responsibly and within your limits. If you or someone you know has a gambling problem, call 1-800-GAMBLER.